What if everything you believe is wrong? That one simple yet earth-shattering question flipped my world upside down. Up until that moment, I was a proud, diehard atheist, someone who only believed in what could be seen, touched, and scientifically explained. But that question hit me like a lightning bolt, cracking open the walls of logic and certainty I had spent years building around my heart. This is a story of radical transformation, a journey that took me from skepticism and disbelief to a faith that's alive and unshakable. Along the way, I wrestled with doubt, faced heartbreaking challenges, and hit rock bottom more than once. But it was in those broken moments that God's light found a way into my life. Buckle up, because this journey is full of unexpected twists and lessons that just might change how you see the world. Stick with me until the end, because I'm going to share something I've never told anyone before. The key moment God used to break through my hardened heart and set me free from atheism. It's a secret that could completely change your perspective, just like it did mine. My name is Liam, and for most of my life, I believed I had all the answers. I grew up in a small suburban town, where faith was woven into the fabric of the community. My parents were devout Christians, and Sunday mornings were sacred. But even as a kid, I felt like none of it made sense. While other kids sat quietly in church, I was the one asking questions no one wanted to answer. If God is good, why is there so much suffering? Or how do you know the Bible isn't just a story someone made up? Those questions planted the first seeds of doubt in my young mind. By the time I hit my teenage years, those seeds had grown into full-blown rebellion. I turned to science and logic as my weapons of choice, wielding them against anything that smelled like faith. I devoured books by famous atheists, took pride in my knowledge of evolution and physics, and openly challenged anyone who dared to talk about God. My friends used to joke that I should have been a lawyer because I could debate circles around anyone, especially Christians. Little did I know, my intellectual superiority was building walls I couldn't see. One memory sticks out vividly. I was sitting at the dinner table with my parents when I blurted out, "How can you believe in a God you've never seen? Isn't that just blind faith?" My mom's face fell, and my dad sighed deeply before saying, "One day, Liam, you'll understand. I just hope it won't be too late." I laughed it off, thinking they were clinging to some outdated crutch. At the time, I saw their faith as weakness, and my rejection of it as freedom. In college, I doubled down on my atheism. I joined a philosophy club and became that guy who always had a clever rebuttal to anything remotely spiritual. I once humiliated a fellow student in front of the group by dismantling his argument for God's existence. People laughed and clapped, and I felt invincible. But looking back, I realized that confidence was nothing more than a mask to hide the emptiness I didn't want to admit. What fueled my arrogance wasn't just the rejection of God. It was the sense of control I thought it gave me. If there was no higher power, no ultimate authority, then I could live life on my terms. I prided myself on being logical, rational, and free-thinking. But deep down, there was always this nagging feeling I couldn't shake. A quiet voice asking, "What if you're wrong?" I remember a particular night during my senior year. I was at a party when a girl I barely knew started talking about her faith. I rolled my eyes and said, "Religion is just a way for people to feel better about dying." She didn't argue back. Instead, she just looked at me with this calm, confident smile and said, "What if you're missing something?" That question stuck with me more than I wanted to admit. The turning point, though, didn't come right away. At that time, I was too stubborn to even entertain the idea of God. I was still caught up in my pride, convinced that faith was for the weak-minded. My life revolved around proving people wrong, and I wore my atheism like a badge of honor. But cracks were starting to form in my perfectly constructed worldview. I started noticing things I couldn't explain, moments of beauty or connection that felt bigger than science. Sunsets that seemed to whisper something sacred. Acts of kindness that defied logic. I dismissed them as coincidence, but they gnawed at me. And then there was the loneliness. For all my bravado, I couldn't ignore the emptiness that crept in during quiet moments. But I pushed those feelings aside and clung to my beliefs even harder. I wasn't ready to let go of my pride or admit that I might not have all the answers. What I didn't know was that everything I believed in was about to be tested in ways I never expected. And that's when my world began to unravel. Not long after graduating college, my life hit a wall I never saw coming. I had landed a decent job, had a tight group of friends, and everything looked perfect on the outside. But then, one phone call changed everything. It was my mom, her voice trembling, telling me my dad had suffered a massive heart attack. I rushed to the hospital, but by the time I got there, it was too late. He was gone. Just like that. I sat in that sterile hospital waiting room, staring at the floor, my mind spinning. This man who'd always been my rock, the one who taught me to ride a bike and never missed a game, was gone. And I was furious, not just at the unfairness of life, but at the emptiness of my own beliefs. I'd spent years rejecting the idea of God, clinging to the notion that life was just random chance. But if that were true, then what did my dad's life even mean? What did any of it mean? That night, I went home to an empty apartment and poured myself a drink, hoping to drown the chaos in my head. But the questions wouldn't stop. How could the universe be so indifferent? How could it just keep spinning like nothing had happened? I told myself this was just the way things were, but deep down it felt hollow. All the logic and reason I had leaned on for so long suddenly felt useless. Over the next few weeks, the cracks in my worldview started to widen. I threw myself into work, trying to keep busy, but the grief was relentless. My friends offered their condolences, but their words felt shallow. "He's in a better place," someone said once, and I snapped back, "No, he's not. He's gone. Period." I thought saying it out loud would make me feel stronger, but it didn't. It just made the void inside me grow. Late one night, I found myself staring at the ceiling, tears streaming down my face, and whispered a question I didn't even believe in. "Is this all there is?" It wasn't a prayer, not yet, but it felt dangerously close. I hated that I was even entertaining the thought of something bigger, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. Something my rational mind couldn't explain. What made it worse was the guilt. I'd spent years mocking faith, laughing at people who believed in God, and now here I was, quietly envying the comfort it seemed to bring them. My mom, for example, was grieving too, but she had this unshakable peace about her. She'd say things like, "I know he's with Jesus now," and instead of rolling my eyes, I found myself wondering, what if she's right? But I wasn't ready to let go of my skepticism. Instead, I doubled down on my usual routine, burying myself in books and podcasts from atheist thinkers. I needed to reassure myself that my beliefs still held water. Yet no matter how much I tried, their arguments no longer felt solid. The answers that once gave me confidence now felt insufficient. I started to notice how empty everything seemed. Conversations with friends felt shallow. Achievements at work felt meaningless. Even the things I used to enjoy, like music and movies, felt dull and lifeless. It was like I was watching my life from the outside, completely disconnected. And that question, "Is this all there is?" kept echoing in my mind louder and louder. It was in that emptiness that a tiny spark of doubt crept into my skepticism. For the first time, I began to consider the possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was something more. But I fought it. I wasn't ready to give up the identity I'd built as a proud atheist. It felt like betrayal, not just to myself, but to everything I'd stood for. So I buried the doubt, hoping it would go away. What I didn't know was that this was just the beginning. That small spark of doubt was about to ignite into something much bigger, something I couldn't ignore. A few months after my dad's death, life felt like an endless fog. I was going through the motions, but nothing felt real. That's when I reconnected with an old college buddy, Eric. We hadn't spoken in years, but he reached out after hearing about my dad. Eric was one of the few Christians I hadn't completely alienated during my atheist crusades. He wasn't preachy, and I respected that. So, When he suggested grabbing coffee, I figured, why not? Sitting across from Eric, I noticed something different about him. He wasn't the same guy I remembered from college. There was a calmness, a quiet strength in the way he carried himself. We talked about life, grief, and the messiness of it all. I kept waiting for him to slip in some kind of God talk, but he didn't, at least not right away. Then, as we were wrapping up, he leaned in and said, "Liam, have you ever really given God a chance?" I smirked, leaning back in my chair. "Eric, you know me. I've read the books. I've done the debates. I've thought about it. It's just not for me." But Eric didn't flinch. Instead, he smiled and said, "I'm not talking about debates or books. I'm talking about you. Have you ever really opened your heart and asked him to show up?" That question hit me harder than I expected. I laughed it off, but inside I felt unsettled. Later that night, I couldn't stop replaying his words in my head. "Have you ever asked him to show up?" The thought made me angry. Why should I ask for something I didn't even believe in? It felt like a trap, a cheap emotional ploy. But then came the other voice, the quieter one, the one I'd been ignoring for months. What if he's right? What if I'm wrong? A few days later, Eric texted me a link to a video. It was a testimony from a man who claimed God had radically transformed his life. I almost didn't watch it. I didn't want to be sucked into what I assumed was some overly emotional, manipulative story. But curiosity got the better of me. The man in the video talked about hitting rock bottom and finding God in his darkest moment. I rolled my eyes at first, but then he said something that stopped me cold. I realized that all my arguments against God were just walls I'd built to protect myself from the truth. That line hit me like a gut punch. I'd spent years building my identity around logic and reason, but deep down, I knew those walls were crumbling. And the scariest part? I had no idea what was on the other side. I felt exposed, vulnerable in a way I hadn't before. For the first time, I wasn't sure if I could trust my own beliefs. I called Eric the next day, half out of frustration, half out of desperation. "Okay," I said, "what's the deal? Why are you so sure about all this God stuff?" He didn't lecture me or throw Bible verses at me. Instead, he shared his own story, a time when he felt lost and broken, much like I did now. "Liam," he said, "I didn't find God because I was looking for him. I found him because he was looking for me." That line haunted me. Was it possible? Could God really be pursuing me, even after all the years I'd spent mocking him? I wanted to dismiss it, to call it wishful thinking, but something inside me wouldn't let it go. It was like a seed had been planted, and no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop it from growing. That night, I lay awake in bed, staring at the ceiling. For the first time in my life, I whispered a silent question into the void. "If you're real, show me." It felt ridiculous, humiliating even. But there it was, the smallest crack in my skepticism, a tiny sliver of hope I didn't even know I had. And that's when it happened, something so unbelievable, so impossible, that it shook me to my core. The night I whispered, "If you're real, show me," I didn't expect anything to happen. I was half convinced I was talking to the ceiling. But the very next day, something strange happened. I was driving to work, stuck in traffic, when my car radio, usually set to a podcast, suddenly switched stations on its own. It landed on a Christian station, and before I could change it, a voice came through, calm and steady. "God sees you. He hasn't forgotten you. Whatever you're going through, you're not alone." I froze, my hand hovering over the dial. Those words felt like they were meant for me, cutting through all the noise in my head. I told myself it was a coincidence, a random glitch. But the timing was eerie. It felt too specific, too personal to ignore. My chest tightened as I pulled over to the side of the road, unable to focus on driving. For the first time in years, I felt something I couldn't explain, a mix of fear, wonder, and an overwhelming sense of being seen. I tried to shake it off. "This is ridiculous," I muttered to myself, slamming the radio off. But the feeling stayed with me all day. It was like a weight on my chest, not heavy in a bad way, but impossible to ignore. That night, I told Eric about what happened, hoping he'd offer some rational explanation. Instead, he just smiled and said, "Liam, maybe that was God answering you." I didn't want to believe it. I couldn't believe it. It was just a coincidence, I argued, pacing back and forth in my apartment. But even as I said it, I didn't sound convinced. Not to Eric, and definitely not to myself. Something deep inside me was shifting, and it scared me. I had spent so long relying on logic and reason to guide me. Now, for the first time, those tools felt useless. A few nights later, I had a dream that shook me to my core. In the dream, I was standing in a dark, endless void. I felt completely alone, cold, and terrified. But then, out of the darkness, a light appeared, small at first, then growing brighter and brighter until it enveloped me. A voice echoed, gentle but powerful, "Come to me, Liam." I woke up in a cold sweat, my heart pounding. It was just a dream, I told myself. But it didn't feel like just a dream. It felt like something or someone was calling me. The logical part of me scrambled for explanations. Maybe it was stress, or my subconscious processing grief. But the deeper part of me knew better. That dream felt real in a way nothing else ever had. The voice, the light, it was like a glimpse of something bigger than myself, something I couldn't control or define. And that terrified me. For days, I wrestled with what I had experienced. Part of me wanted to dismiss it, to chalk it up to random chance. But another part of me, one I hadn't listened to in years, kept whispering, "What if it's true? What if God is really reaching out to you?" That question haunted me. Every time I tried to ignore it, something else would happen to bring it back. I remember sitting in a coffee shop one afternoon, trying to distract myself with work. A woman at the next table was talking to her friend, and I couldn't help but overhear. "Sometimes, you just have to trust that God has a plan, even when you don't understand it," she said. Her words sent chills down my spine. It was like the universe, or God himself, was conspiring to get my attention. But I still resisted. I told myself it was all in my head, a mix of grief and coincidence. I wasn't ready to give up the control I thought I had over my life. Accepting what was happening would mean admitting I'd been wrong all along, and my pride wouldn't let me do that. Yet. But as much as I tried to push it away, the call only grew louder. And then something even more incredible happened, something I couldn't ignore, no matter how hard I tried. The battle inside me came to a head one night. I couldn't ignore the signs anymore. The dream, the radio, the words from strangers that felt too intentional to be chance. But what pushed me over the edge was the emptiness I couldn't escape. No matter how much I tried to reason it away, there was a gaping hole inside me that nothing, no logic, no distraction, no accomplishment could fill. So that night, alone in my apartment, I did something I never thought I'd do. I got down on my knees. At first, I didn't know what to say. I felt ridiculous, like a fraud. But then the words started spilling out. "God, I don't even know if you're real. I don't know if you're listening. But if you are, I'm tired. I can't keep doing this on my own. If you're there, show me. Help me." My voice broke as tears streamed down my face. It wasn't eloquent or polished. It was raw, messy, and desperate. The most honest I'd ever been in my life. As I knelt there, something happened that I can't fully explain. It was like a wave of warmth washed over me, starting in my chest and spreading through my whole body. The air in the room felt different, thicker, almost electric. And then came a sense of peace, so profound it brought me to tears all over again. It was like I had been carrying this unbearable weight for years, and suddenly it was lifted. In that moment, it felt like the walls I had built around my heart were crumbling. I didn't see a vision or hear an audible voice, but there was an undeniable presence in the room. It was as if God was saying, "I've been here all along, waiting for you to come to me." The love I felt was overwhelming, like nothing I had ever experienced. It was pure, unconditional, and undeniable. The next morning, everything looked different. The sunlight streaming through my window seemed brighter, more alive. The birds outside sounded sweeter. It was like a veil had been lifted from my eyes, and for the first time, I could see the beauty and purpose in the world around me. Even my reflection in the mirror looked different, like the hardness in my face had softened. But it wasn't just what I saw, it was what I felt. For the first time in years, I felt free. Free from the anger, the pride, and the endless need to prove myself. It was like my soul had taken a deep breath after holding it in for far too long. I didn't have all the answers, but I didn't need them. I finally understood what Eric meant when he said, "It's not about debates or arguments. It's about opening your heart." Over the next few days, I couldn't stop thinking about what had happened. Was it real? Could it really be God? Every time doubt tried to creep in, that peace would return, silencing my fears. I started to pray, not just desperate cries for help, but real conversations with God. And for the first time, I opened a Bible. I didn't know where to start, so I just flipped it open. My eyes landed on Matthew 11 verse 28. "Come to me, all who are weary and burdened, and I will give you rest." That verse felt like it was written just for me. I read it over and over, the words sinking deep into my heart. I realized that all my striving, all my attempts to control my life, had led me nowhere. What I needed wasn't more answers. It was a relationship. And that's what God was offering me. Not rules, not religion, but a chance to know Him and be known by Him. I wish I could say that everything made perfect sense after that moment, but it didn't. I still had questions, doubts, and moments of fear. But what changed was that I wasn't carrying them alone anymore. God was with me, guiding me, and for the first time, I felt like I had a purpose. But the most extraordinary part of my journey was still ahead, because what God did after I surrendered to Him was something I never saw coming, and it changed my life forever. After I surrendered that night, everything started to change. It wasn't immediate, like flipping a switch, but little by little, I began to notice how differently I was seeing the world. The bitterness that once defined me, it was slipping away. I found myself smiling at things I used to ignore, the beauty in nature, the kindness in others, and the overwhelming peace that seemed to settle deep within my soul. It wasn't just about belief anymore, it was about a whole new way of living. My mornings were different. I woke up no longer dreading the day ahead, but filled with a quiet sense of anticipation. I'd start my day with prayer, even if it was just a short moment, before diving into the chaos of work or life. I began to understand that God wasn't just a part of my life. He was the foundation, the one thing that anchored me when everything else felt shaky. And as I walked through each day, I realized that I wasn't alone in the struggles or victories. He was right there guiding me. One of the biggest changes came in the way I viewed relationships. Before, I'd push people away when things got tough. I was always quick to cut ties, never letting anyone get too close. But now, I started letting people in. I began to rebuild relationships that had once felt broken, mending them with forgiveness and understanding. The more I leaned into God, the more I felt His love for others, and it changed the way I treated those around me. I was no longer living with my walls up, and that made all the difference. As I dove deeper into my faith, I began reading Scripture with new eyes. Passages that once seemed distant or irrelevant now spoke directly to my heart. Philippians 4 verses 6 to 7, about casting your anxieties on God and finding peace, became my lifeline. I learned to surrender not just my big, dramatic moments, but the small, everyday stresses too. And the peace? It surpassed all the logic I once held so dear. The fear of the unknown, the pressure to have everything figured out, no longer crushing. But perhaps the most profound shift happened when I started to understand my purpose. Before, my life felt like it was just about surviving, getting by, making it through another day. But now I knew there was something more. God had a purpose for me, one that wasn't about chasing after success or approval. It was about serving Him, living with integrity, and sharing His love with others. I no longer felt adrift. I felt grounded in something far bigger than myself. And so, I took steps in faith. I got involved in my church, began volunteering, and started having honest conversations with others about faith. I didn't have all the answers, but I knew this: God had changed me. And if he could do that for someone like me, someone so set in their ways, so entrenched in doubt, he could change anyone. I couldn't keep this newfound hope to myself. It wasn't about religion, it was about transformation, and I wanted to be part of that in the world. Now I stand here, sharing this story with you. If you're watching this, and you feel like I did, lost, skeptical, empty, please hear me. There is hope. You don't have to have everything figured out. You don't have to be perfect. All it takes is one step of faith, one moment of surrender. And in that moment, everything can change. My story is not just about how I left atheism behind. It's about how God completely transformed every part of my life. The man I was before, he's gone. And the man I am now, he's walking in God's purpose. And you know what? He can do the same for you. Thank you so much for sticking with me through this journey. I hope my story resonated with you in some way, whether you're questioning your own faith or just needing a reminder that God's grace is real. I'd love to hear your story too. If you feel comfortable, share it in the comments. Let's create a community of hope where we can support and encourage one another through our walks of faith. You never know who might be encouraged by your words. If this video touched you, don't keep it to yourself. Share it with someone who might need to hear this message today. Maybe there's someone in your life who feels lost, hopeless, or questioning everything they've ever believed. God's love has the power to reach them just like it reached me. And remember, no matter where you are, no matter what you've done, God has never given up on you. Before you go, take a second to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next testimony. There's so much more coming, and I'd love for you to be a part of it. God's still writing our stories. Let's keep walking in faith together.